This is a topic I'm really excited about as well. So let me just make sure okay. Yeah. All right. So first I want to acknowledge people who have made this possible. So I was fortunate to do a sabbatical in Auckland, New Zealand earlier this year, and I worked with some collaborators there, Paul Denny and Andrew Luxton Riley, who are computer science education researchers who happen to also had been involved with working with large language models. So together we were able to collaborate on this work, and it's been a lot of fun. Also, some of my collaborators or colleagues here at BYU have been instrumental in making this happen. Some amazing students, undergrad students who have been TAs or research assistants over the years. It's been great working with them, and they've contributed in important ways to this work. And then I'm going to talk about 3 different kind of sub-talks today. And for the latter 2, I want to acknowledge OpenAI, who provided some credits that enabled us to test some of their models addressing some of the questions that we have. Okay, and I don't think this will surprise anybody here, but we know that it's really critical that biologists use computational tools and methods. A survey was done in 2017 where biology PIs, so these are people who had been funded by the NSF, nearly 90% of them said that they are currently or will soon be analyzing large data sets. And I'm sort of extrapolating from that they need computational tools and methods to be able to work with those large data sets. We're no longer in an era where we can just do everything by hand. And not only using existing tools is important, but also being able to have computer programming skills is critical. So being able to do things like create your own tools or interface with application programming interfaces of existing tools, customize existing tools. We know there's a huge problem with untidy data, I'll call it, or needing to wrangle data, clean it up, get it to a point where you can analyze it. There's a lot of custom programming that often needs to occur there. And then also just more broadly, computational reproducibility. When we implement our analysis in code, we can make sure that other people can more easily reproduce our findings and understand exactly what we did. And this is not true just in biology, it's true in other fields as well. A survey back in 2011 revealed that maybe around 35% or somewhere in that ballpark of the time people were doing research, they were actually writing code. So whether that's exactly accurate, I don't know, but it sort of suggests that this is a huge need where people are spending time writing code and doing things related to science that involves writing code. We also know that it's a challenging problem to teach people how to write code, for many of us to learn how to write code. It's not as simple as just reading a book and being able to do it. It takes practice. There's a whole field of computer science education that has for decades tried to crack the code of how to do this effectively, and there's still a lot to be learned in that way, in that area. Okay, and I also want to point out this idea of, in the computer science education literature, the term end user programmers is used. So it's this idea that in an interdisciplinary context, many times the goals for learning are different, or the goals for research are different than for, say, a computer scientist, where for a computer scientist, they may be, who's earning a degree, their goal may be to become a professional programmer where programming is their primary responsibility. Whereas somebody who is a biologist and wants to be able to do science, the science part may be their primary goal, and the programming may be a means of accomplishing that goal. And so there are different educational goals for those 2 different audiences, and so that's also important to think about. In biology specifically, this I don't really have data to back this up, but this is, I think, rings true in that many times when biologists are writing code, they're writing programs or scripts that are often small, maybe tens of lines of code or a few hundred lines of code, or maybe even a few thousand, but that is still relatively small compared to the code bases of many software tools. There are people who are bioinformaticians who are creating tools that may be more complex than that, but biologists are often writing relatively small bodies of code. And that code might only be used for one project. So instead of creating something that might be used by hundreds or thousands of people, many times that code is just being used in one particular context. And so here at BYU, we have an undergraduate bioinformatics major, but we also have some other majors where students, or where the faculty want their students to develop bioinformatics skills. And we've created this course called Introduction to Bioinformatics. And the learning objectives are to give students a feel for the field of bioinformatics, to give them some experience at the command line, but also the bulk of the course is focused on Python programming, giving them enough skill that they have a foundation that they can work from in order to start doing research on bioinformatics. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of exercises we give them to help them learn these skills, we have many that are biology oriented, trying to give them a context that will be motivating and interesting to them. And so we'll give them programming exercises that they use as homework that are something like this. So this is an abbreviated form, but suppose that you work for the Forest Service and your job is to observe wildlife. Write a Python function that, given a list of animals and their weights, returns the name of the individual with the lowest weight. Here's another one. Write a Python function that identifies simple sequence repeats in a given DNA sequence. And specifically, we ask them to use a regular expression. So if you're not familiar with what that is, that's a text-based pattern to identify all series of AT nucleotides that repeat 3 or 4 times and are preceded and followed by a G or C nucleotide. And just one more. We have them do things like this. Use the pandas package, that's a Python package, to read and filter a data file with clinical information from endometrial cancer patients. And then we have them use another package called Seaborn to create a box plot that would illustrate the data. So generally, these are relatively small exercises that would require them to write maybe at the max 100 lines of code. But we hope, or we see, that with repeated practice, they tend to develop those some pretty good skills by the end of the course at writing Python code. Okay, so as happened for all of you about a year ago, I started hearing about large language models, ChatGPT, and just to give you a little background on those in case you are not familiar with them, these are models that are trained using a deep learning approach, specifically transformer architectures, and they generate text and code in response to human language prompts. So hearing about this and talking to some of my students who had kind of played around with it, I started to think, what does this mean for this course that I teach, where I'm teaching Python? What if ChatGPT can just solve all of these problems for them? And what does that all mean for me going forward? Okay, so what you can do is you can take text, as I mentioned, you can copy it into ChatGPT, and it'll give you output something like this. So I tried this a few times with some of these problems that I was giving to my students in this Introduction to Bioinformatics course, and I was surprised at how well it was solving some of these problems. So that made me think, okay, what does this mean again, and how do I need to respond to this? And about that time, I was heading down to New Zealand, so I worked with my collaborators, and we decided to do a formal evaluation to try basically all of these programming problems that we use in this class, formally assess them using ChatGPT and see how well it could solve the problems. Okay, so we have a total of 184 different exercises that they complete throughout the course, broken down into about 20 different assignments. We also have 3 exams that they complete that also require them to do programming, and those are in a place where they wouldn't have access to the web or ChatGPT. So we focused on the 184 that they could potentially copy and paste the code into ChatGPT and get answers or get help with the code that they're trying to write. And I just want to emphasize these are formative exercises. So we're hoping that as students work on these, that they're gaining new skills, they're formulating new connections in their brains that are going to help them do well on the exams and hopefully beyond the course to succeed at Python programming and as practicing biologists to be able to use those skills. Because they're formative, we weren't anticipating or expecting them to get their answers right on the first attempt. And the same thing with ChatGPT. We wanted to give it multiple attempts. If it didn't get it right on the first time, we wanted to let the model try again, and we would provide feedback to the model. I was the one who did that. My goal was to try to simulate an interaction that might occur between a student and the model. I can't say that I perfectly modeled that, but I tried to limit the amount of feedback that I would give from an expert's point of view and focus on the kind of interaction that a student might make. Okay, so I copied each of the prompts into ChatGPT, and this is version 3.5. The prompt explained how the code would be tested, including the expected outputs, and that's the same thing we give to our students. On some of them, we have data files. So these are usually tab-separated data files or FASTA files, FASTQ files, those kinds of things, that usually very small in size, but something that the student's code would need to read in and be able to do something with it. Then we tested the generated code, the code that ChatGPT generated. We put it into the same auto grader that our students use to evaluate whether their code is functioning properly. And I want to put a quick little plug in for this. This is something that my lab has created. We call it Code Buddy. It's an open source tool. I won't go into details, but I feel like it has features that I know that it has features that other tools don't have. Though, you know, there are going to be strengths and weaknesses with any tool, but it's a tool that's out there, and I'd love to hear any feedback, or if anybody's interested in using it, I'd love to talk to you. Okay, and so this is what it looks like for students. They'll get a prompt, they type in their code, they click on submit, it'll tell them whether they got it right. And so I went through that same process with the code that ChatGPT had generated. If the output did not match, we allowed up to 10 interactions with the model. Okay, I kind of already said this. I was the one who was interacting with the model rather than students. And here's what we found. So of the 184 exercises, ChatGPT was able to produce fully functional code that passed all of the tests for all but 5 of them within 10 attempts. So 75% of them it solved on the first attempt, whereas others it took up to 7 attempts before it was able to successfully solve those. Just a little overview of where it fell short, where the ones that it wasn't able to solve. So there was one where it was trying to identify CPG islands in a DNA sequence. And one of the tests was an edge case where there were exactly 10% of the sequences that were CG pairs. For whatever reason, the model could not quite figure out how to solve that particular problem. There were a couple where it was needing to write regular expressions, dealing correctly with non-alphanumeric characters, and it had a hard time on a couple of those. Though in other cases, it wrote regular expressions really well. It did well in other examples. And then there was one where it was the longest question that we give to our students, and it struggled on that one that was particularly long, and where the instructor's solution was particularly long relative to the other ones. Just a little insight into this. So the lines of code per solution. So you can see here, this is for the instructor solution. As I mentioned, the longest, the hardest, or the most complex problem it struggled at, but there are others that were relatively long that it did pretty well at, and then some that were relatively short that it struggled with. So it's not, I don't think it's necessarily the length or the complexity that's always the predictor of whether the model will be successful. There are other factors at play in that. One thing that we did as part of a paper that we published on this is, by the time we were getting to the point where we were publishing a paper on this, Google had released a large language model called BARD that was capable of generating code. And so we wanted to try that and get a sense for how well do other large language models work. So for about a third of those exercises, we went through the same process with Google BARD, and it did quite well on many of them, though it wasn't able to successfully solve nearly as many as ChatGPT was able to. If you want to see the full details of all the analysis that we did, we recently published a paper in PLOS Computational Biology. I'd love to have you read that and give us any feedback on it. So I want to talk a little bit about implications of this, and this is just me kind of thinking about how I interpret things. So one conclusion I have is that these findings indicate a considerable advance over previous large language models. So believe it or not, before ChatGPT, there were others around for at least for a couple of years before ChatGPT came out. And in the literature, I found that solve rates for similar types of problems, the level, like the size of problems, were in about the 80 to 85% range at the max. Whereas, however, these exercises, many of them did not use data files, have to generate graphics, or use external Python packages like the ones that we tested. So I think it's fair to say that ChatGPT is a significant improvement over previous models, and it continues to improve to this day. It's important to mention that programming remains an important skill for life scientists to learn. I don't think at any time soon will these models replace bioinformaticians or the need for biologists to learn to write code. I do think that they can be really helpful collaborators. They can help with debugging. They can help with certain tasks that are repetitive, things like that. They can make us more efficient, I think, but I don't think that they replace what we're trying to do. A caveat of this research are programming exercises. So from this 100 level course that we teach, these don't necessarily represent the types of tasks that bioinformaticians or end user biologists, for that matter, the types of tasks that they perform in the real world. They're relatively simple, but I think they do represent us to a certain extent the types of skills that you would need to gain as a biologist end user. Another important thing to mention, functional code validation is critical. So just like anything that you get from the web, you don't want to just accept it at face value. You need to have a way of evaluating whether that code that's being generated is working correctly. And I think that this is an area in the new era of large language models. I do think that's going to be something that educators are going to have to think more about. How do we ensure that students are good at validating their code, or researchers who are learning to write code? It's been something that's been a big thing for software engineers over the years, but for end users, biologists who are just saying, let's just write some code and get it to work, maybe they're not thinking as much about formal ways of validating code. I think that's something that could definitely be improved in our educational materials. I do think that large language models have potential to make research more efficient. Just anecdotally, I've seen that. I use it pretty much every day when I'm writing code. Fortunately, still, even as an associate professor, I do find a little bit of time to write code. And as I do that, I use ChatGPT as a collaborator. And it's often wrong, but it's also often really helpful to me. So for whatever that's worth. I wanted to show this tweet from Jason Williams, who's part of this community. And he said, this is very important. So referring to our results, I'd love to see 50 to 70% of easy bioinformatics questions answered by GPT, freeing up people to work on the hard things. So I think that's really where large language models currently excel, is with tasks that they've seen, maybe not the exact task have they been trained on, but they've seen similar types of tasks, and they can help you with similar types of tasks that you might be performing. If you have a really obscure task, it might be a little harder at doing that, and you can maybe focus your brain power on those more difficult tasks and let large language models help with some of those easier ones. Just a silly example, I do a lot of coding in R. I use the tidyverse, I use ggplot2, and I don't know if any of you can relate, but it's often hard to remember the exact syntax that I need to use in order to rotate the axis labels, for example, or center the title or something like that. So I could go and I could Google around for a while, but I can often just go to ChatGPT and it'll sort of summarize a lot of things that are out there and help me to be more efficient in figuring those things out. Some evidence that other people are doing this is that Stack Overflow traffic has been down of late. And if I remember right, they've also gone through some layoffs recently. So I'm not saying that's a good thing, just saying I think it's a reality that people are using large language models as an assistant in the coding process. Prompt engineering, or this idea of figuring out how to exactly interact with large language models, that's also a useful skill that I think will become more and more important. If we can get good at that, then we may be able to be even more efficient in using these models. And regarding prompt engineering, the exercises that we fed into the model, those have been refined over several years with feedback from teaching assistants and students, and we have multiple instructors who are using these exercises. So these are really clearly written. Confusing parts, for the most part, I think have been removed over the years. And so we're kind of giving the model a gold standard of something that it should be able to understand pretty well. Whereas if you're just going in and typing something in, it may take a while to help the model understand exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And it can be cognitively taxing to interact with large language models, coming up with good prompts. When it doesn't get things right, trying to figure out the right way to convince it or explain to it how to understand what you want it to do. And I kind of already mentioned this, but instructors, I think, also now need to reconsider how they assess students. So at least on exams, I think it's important, if you want your students to demonstrate that they actually do have programming skills, you need to assess them in an environment that requires them to demonstrate mastery of those skills. And so at our university, we have a building that where students aren't able to access the internet, and they have to go in and solve these programming problems without outside help. I think that large language models can be an educational resource, but it's still, as I mentioned earlier, important that they develop those skills independently. One paper that was published in the last year that I thought was really interesting as far as assessing students' abilities is this technique that uses large language models to generate multiple choice questions about code that students submit in response to exams or assignments. So if they submit something, the large language model will take that code, generate a question, and then ask the student to answer, something about the code. And then if they can answer that correctly, that will provide some evidence that they actually understand the code that they wrote, rather than that they're just blindly copying and pasting from ChatGPT without really understanding what they're doing. Okay, so I want to move to the second part of my talk. I will say that these next two are unpublished at this point. We're working on writing up papers for this paper for the second one. The third one's still a little bit preliminary, but we'll get into that in a minute. So the question here was, how well can a large language model translate programming exercises from one programming language to another? Okay, and there were two motivations behind this. One was an educational motivation. So if we can take existing exercises that are in, say, Python and translate them into other programming languages, we can then give exercises that help our students learn those languages more easily, rather than having to go in by hand and translate everything. If we can use a model to do that, a lot of it automatically, then that could be really beneficial. The literature shows that in computing courses, and this is not specific to bioinformatics, 88% of all surveyed schools only use one of four languages: Java, Python, C++, and C. Python is growing rapidly, and some of these other languages are going down in popularity. Two languages that are becoming more popular in the biology community are Rust and Julia. And there are papers, commentaries in Nature that are talking about these languages and saying, it really could be beneficial to biologists to learn these languages. There are advantages as far as speed. So at least in some tests that I've run, Rust tends to perform speed-wise on par with C++, which is known as being a fast language. And there's also issues of memory safety. This is a tweet from somebody at Microsoft saying that recently Microsoft is going big on Rust, and they're going to convert a lot of the core code that they use in Azure, I believe it is, over to Rust. And the primary motivation there is memory safety. But I think there's also benefits as far as it being an enjoyable language for people to code in. In surveys that are given to programmers, Rust is at the top or near the top of languages that people enjoy writing code in. And I would say probably more so than C++. And then Julia is also becoming popular in the biology community. There's a really nice paper that was published in Nature Methods recently talking about some of the advantages of Julia. So maybe for biologists, being able to teach students these languages could be a really useful thing, not just Python, but some other languages that have some nice advantages. Another motivation is research. So although for the most part, I'm focusing on small, simple exercises, there is potential that if we can use a large language model to translate code from one language to another, that we could use it in this context of being able to design, implement our ideas in a relatively straightforward language like Python, where we don't have to worry so much about memory management and things like that, or speed. Get the logic implemented, and then once we have the logic implemented well there, if large language models are successful at translating code, we could then say, okay, now let's create a Rust version or a Julia version of that code that may perform may execute much more quickly than the Python version of the code, rather than starting from Rust or Julia at the beginning. You're still going to need to know how to program in the language, the target language, but it can make you more efficient in getting to that point potentially. Okay, so as I mentioned, we tested this using relatively simple exercises. So some of those are the ones that I talked about in the first part of my talk, which are the ones that we use in Introduction to Bioinformatics. We excluded some of the exercises that were specific to Python, the ones that were using the pandas and Seaborn and BioPython packages, and some that did type checking in Python specific ways. So that left us with 134 exercises. The instructor solutions were anywhere from 1 to 60 lines of code. And then we also used an open source collection of programming exercises that are, I think it was people at Google came up with these, and in this preprint that was published a couple of years ago, they released a bunch of these exercises that again were relatively small in size. On average, I think it was 6 lines of code that the solutions were. That's how many lines of code the solutions had. Okay, so we wanted to test this not just for Rust and Julia, but also C++ as a well-established programming language, and then also for JavaScript, which is well-established, and lots of people are using it in general, maybe not so much in biology. In getting ready to submit the code to ChatGPT, we removed or translated language-specific terms in the prompts. So instead of saying, write a Python list that will do such and such, we would say, create a vector or something like that to do such and such. We remove language-specific details from the output. So sometimes the outputs that these languages produce are different from what you would get in Python. So in order to make it consistent, we remove some of those language-specific things. And then we converted everything to lowercase just to try to remove some variability in what we were doing. We had three kinds of inputs. So the first was the prompt only. So kind of like in the first study that I talked about, we would just give it the prompt and like, this is what you need to do. Here's the expected output, those kinds of things. In a second scenario, we would give the Python code for the solution and then also the test code. And we would ask the model to translate the code from one language to another. And then thirdly, we tried the prompt and the code together just to see how would it do in each of those 3 different scenarios. We used, in this case, ChatGPT or GPT-4, specific version of that, a temperature of 0.7. And so the max for temperature is 1, the min is 0. So this is saying if we submit multiple times, then allow for some variability or let the model try some different types of solutions rather than just focusing on one particular type of solution. We use the chat. And as I mentioned earlier, we requested that the model translate the test code as well, so that we could be able to test it in the same language as the solution. When we were interacting with the model, we used a prompt like this. So we would say, you are a helpful assistant who generates, let's say, Rust code. You're given a prompt and some accompanying Python code for testing. Implement Rust code in response to the prompt. Translate the testing code to Rust and put it in a main method. Don't provide any comments on how the code works or any other text. Just provide code. And we did that to try to reduce the noise that we'd have to parse out of the output once we got it back. And here's an overview of the results that we got. So I did truncate the y-axis here. So I know people say not to do that, but I'm just showing you here that most of these languages performed really well, where it eventually solved within 10 attempts again, eventually solved almost all of these exercises. Okay, and you can see the different lines there. The lines at the top of each are what we got. Well, let me actually start with the ones at the bottom. So the bottom, the dark blue, are the ones where it was the prompt only. So it typically performed worse with the prompt only, though in Julia, I'm not sure why, it tended to perform the best there. When we gave it just the code, that was kind of in the middle. When we gave it the prompt and code, it sometimes performed better than the others, like with Rust, but in other cases, it didn't perform so well. And then we said, did any of these three types of prompts lead to a successful solution? So that's the any line. And we found that if we combine all that together, it may not have worked well for one type of input, but in general, it worked well in almost every case for at least one of them. Some of the errors that we got, and I'll just focus on Rust and Julia with this, were compile errors. The Rust compiler tends to be kind of picky. And so it struggled at times to overcome compiler errors. Logic errors are just, it's functional code, but it's not quite giving us the output that we would expect. Sometimes we ran into formatting issues, panic errors, where basically it's a runtime error where it's not able to handle the load that we're giving the processor, things like that. It was kind of similar for Julia. The types of errors that you get are a little bit different, but again, compile time errors, runtime errors, logic errors were the most common. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the third project. And again, this is preliminary. I debated whether to include this, but I just figured I'd throw it out there and we could see what you think. So the question here is, how well can a large language model act as a virtual assistant to novice programmers? So in our course, we have a group of TAs who are amazing. We have a lot of them. We make them available throughout most of the week because students get really frustrated when they get stuck on problems. They can't overcome them, so they'll go to a TA. A TA will help them understand what's causing the problem, and this has been a really important part of the success of the course. But it can be challenging because the TAs are, they may not be available at 2 in the morning, for example, if I'm working on a problem at 2 in the morning, or they may be on the other side of campus, or they may communicate in a way that is difficult for me to understand or something like that. And so we said, can we use this technology of large language models to act as a virtual assistant to novice programmers in a course? And so in CodeBuddy, this is the auto I mentioned earlier, we have a feature where when a student creates an account in the system, they're randomly assigned to what we call a research cohort. So research cohort A or B is just randomly going to pick one or the other of those. So that enables us to do research where we can try one intervention on group A and another one on group B and compare what the outcomes are for those two groups. So we did this study in a course, a different one than the one I mentioned earlier. It's called Statistical Analysis for Biologists. In contrast to the other course, we teach the R statistical software and programming language. But we also have a lot of these kind of short form programming exercises and also a couple of exams where students have to demonstrate their ability to write code in R. Later on in the course, we cover statistics and applying those skills in a statistics and machine learning context. But the first parts of the course are focused on just programming skills for the most part. We used a counterbalanced design where for the first unit, we enabled the virtual assistant for group A, whereas group B did not have access to the virtual assistant. And then during unit 2, we did the opposite, where we made the virtual assistant available to group B, but not group A. And we measured after the fact for both of those. And I will say, as I mentioned earlier, this is a preliminary study where kind of a pilot study where we're trying to make sure that everything is in place and working right. And I did have a problem with the survey data that I was collecting where I was only able to collect part of it. So next semester, we're gonna continue this study with a larger cohort. But I'll just give you a sense of what we found for our pilot study. So this is what it looks like in CodeBuddy. So next to the place in the app where you see the instructions on what students see the instructions on what they're supposed to do, and then they have the box where they write code. Next to that, they'll have a panel that looks like this. They'll say, hello, I'm your virtual assistant. Do your best to solve the exercise on your own, but if you get stuck, you can enter a question below, and kind of giving caveats. This is experimental, so it may or may not be helpful. And then we tried as well as we could, because these students in group A and group B were taking the same course at the same time. So we tried to encourage them to not let somebody else use this feature for their code if they didn't have access to it themselves, to try to reduce the amount of noise in our study. We gave them up to 3 or 4 interactions that they could have with the model, and we instructed the model not to give them the answer, but to try to help them along, help them move one step forward in the process of solving these exercises. So just an example. Student asks, can you give me the answer? It would say, this is actually one where it said this: as an assistant, I cannot provide the answer directly, but I can guide you. Your current code is on the right track. And then it gives some advice on how to move forward. And then later, if you asked, my output has too many lines, so they're supposed to just print the first 5 countries from a data set that they're working with. How can I fix that? And so then it gave them some advice on how to do that. And this is I'll throw in a caveat here that also applies to the first study that I talked about. In this case, it's suggesting that they use this function called slice_min in order to just get the top 5 countries. And I'm sure that function would solve the problem for the student, but it is a bit problematic in that we don't teach that specific function to the students in the class. So maybe that's really good for a student who wants to learn a new function and is open to that and is willing to look up the documentation on that function to make sure they understand how it works. But for a student who just wants to get the answer and maybe isn't willing to think and do that, think as much and do that additional research on how the function works, this could be detrimental because now we're introducing a new function to them that they don't fully understand. Okay, here's some results. I'll just give you a bunch of graphs to kind of illustrate what we're finding. So the first thing I was curious about is when were students using this? As I mentioned earlier, they might be working on these problems when a TA is not available. And so we looked at that and we found that other than between 2 in the morning and about 7 in the morning, 6 in the morning, students are working on these problems all hours of the day. Many of those hours in the middle there overlap with when TAs would be available, but especially in the evenings, they're working on these when TAs are not available. So I think there's potential, or this is just kind of illustrating that it's something that students want to use at different times of day. This is showing the total interactions per student across all of the exercises. So when they had access to it and when, so for students who actually did try using it, how many times did they interact with the virtual assistant? And as you can see to the right, there were some students who used this quite often, as many as 35 times throughout the unit when it was available to them, whereas others didn't use it at all or used it very little. So I'm not showing the ones who didn't use it at all. This is showing the total interactions per exercise. So some exercises were there were more times that students were interacting with the virtual assistant relative to others. So this could be a useful tool for an instructor to say, okay, which ones are students having the hardest time with? Maybe I can go in and beef up my instruction on whatever skills are being covered in those exercises. Or maybe I need to clarify something in the instructions to help students not have to struggle quite so much on those. or maybe at least struggle in a good way rather than in a frustrating way. In the survey that we gave out, we asked them how helpful they found the virtual assistant to be. So this is just showing for the second unit. As I mentioned, I had a problem with data collection on the survey, but I did have a full set of responses for the second unit. And so many of them didn't have access to it. Some of them did have access to it, but didn't use it. But of the people who did, there was only, I think it was just one student who said it was somewhat unhelpful. Everybody else said it was somewhat helpful or extremely helpful. To give you a sense for the kinds of thoughts that students expressed as they interacted with it, one student said, if I had a general, so this is one who said it was somewhat unhelpful. If I had a general question about an idea, for example, what type of functions was is.na or where was na.rm used? So don't worry exactly what that means if you're not familiar with it, but these are just ways of dealing with missing values in R. They said then it was helpful in identifying that, but when I asked it specific questions, it was not helpful. Here's one comment from somebody who found the tool to be somewhat helpful. They said the virtual assistant was most useful when my code was almost correct, but I didn't understand what the problem was. I could ask it what was wrong with my code, and it did a good job at elaborating on why the error was a problem and how it needed to be changed, so I would know next time that came up. I think that's a good outcome. That's the kind of help that I hope the virtual assistant would give to students. And then one of the students who said it was extremely helpful said, the virtual assistant is very helpful for me after I have written code, but it is not working the way I expect. I ask the virtual assistant why a certain function isn't working, and it is very accurate in telling me what syntax problems I have with that function. These students could always go straight to ChatGPT or other large language models and ask for help. The hope is that rather than doing that, they would use this virtual assistant and get some help, but not too much, or enough help that they're still learning, but not so much that they're just blindly copying and pasting. Okay, now for some actual data here. And this was a bit surprising to me, this and some of the other results that I'm going to share. So this is showing on the y-axis, it's showing the mean number of submissions per exercise. And you can see the A and B cohorts on the left and right. You have Unit 1 on the left panel and Unit 2 on the right panel. So on Unit 1, the A group had access to the virtual assistant and the B group did not. There wasn't a significant difference in how many submissions they made, whereas for the second unit, where Group B did have access to it, they actually made more submissions than Group B. Again, this is preliminary. If we adjust for multiple testing, that wouldn't really be a significant finding, but it was interesting to see a trend towards more submissions per exercise, suggesting that possibly these students were staying longer and working on these longer, and rather than giving up quickly when they were getting stuck. Then we looked at the number of exercises that were passed, where they successfully passed all of the tests. And there was no significant difference for either group in the number that were passed. And then kind of the holy grail, or what we hope, is that students will be able to demonstrate that they demonstrate mastery better when we make an intervention than when we don't make an intervention. What we found in Unit 1 was that there was no difference between the two, no significant difference between the two. In the second unit, we actually found that those who had access to the virtual assistant had lower exam scores overall than those who didn't have access to it. That may just be a function of a relatively small sample size. There were, after we excluded people who did not consent to participate in the study, I think it was 30, 35 or a number around there of students whose data we were able to analyze. Okay, so I just want to make two last comments. I think that large language models are sort of like this really powerful tool that can do amazing things, and it's a challenge to know how can we harness that for good. I think there's a lot of potential there, but there's still a lot of questions to be answered. And I focus mostly on an education context in this talk, but I think there's a lot of interesting questions about evaluating its usefulness in a research context as well. And then lastly, I just want to reiterate my comment that I don't see this type of tool replacing us as humans anytime soon. Again, I think it has great potential to assist us and make us more efficient in certain circumstances, and also help students' educational processes to be more efficient in certain circumstances. I think there's still a very important role that humans play in all of that. Okay, I'd love to hear any questions that you might have, and I'm also open to collaboration opportunities. If you want to try out CodeBuddy or do some kind of an educational study, I'd love to talk to you and see if we can come up with something that's interesting to both of us. Thank you. Patricia, do you want me to go ahead and answer questions, or do you want to moderate those, or how should we? Looks like you're on mute. Yeah.
All right, I could talk now. I changed my headphones. Yes, so there are two questions. One of them was about how we can contact you about a CodeBuddy. So you are there, you have your slide, you have the details on how to contact you. Just said also that again. It's very nice. This seems very interesting tool as well. And there's another one that you kind of answered also during the talk, that is about how do you think there is a way to estimate the impact of ChatGPT and similars in the quality of code and overall research produced by scientists in life science. So
yeah. Well, I mentioned that that's important. I do think it's important. I have some ideas that I'm kind of mulling over as far as studies that could be done in that. I think I shouldn't say in any scenario, but I think one thing that's important is to have domain experts come or evaluate the content that's generated by ChatGPT. So being able to have humans review that and decipher that. I haven't seen any studies that, and I haven't looked recently, but I haven't seen anywhere experts are saying, okay, here's some code that's being produced and how good is that, or how useful is that to life scientists. But I think that would be a really interesting thing to study.
Mm-hmm. There's someone, Rodolphe, raised your hand. Allow. I'm going to let Rodolphe talk. Rodolphe, can you talk? There it comes.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. This is a very, very interesting subject for me because just like you, I also make use of those language models to program whenever I need it. And I do not see it as a replacement for humans at the moment, but it does allow us to focus on what truly matters, and those are the decisions and our algorithm in general. So what we decide to do with the data and what it represents. So thank you for answering my question on how you would assess the impact. But I think I have a more open-ended comment / question, because ever since I started working with bioinformatics nearly 10 years ago, there was always a discussion about what is bioinformatics. Is bioinformatics a branch of biology going towards computational science, or the other way around? Is it a branch of computational science going towards biology? And this cooked in my head for years until I came up with my own understanding of this, and perhaps you have a different opinion. But in my view, bioinformatics is biology, and the bioinformatics that we do is nothing but a tool that we use to make biological research, just like the woodworker makes use of a saw and a hammer to create a chair, and the chair is actually the biology. What will be your take on that? Considering now that those language models, those artificial intelligences, they would basically draw the line even clearer, where you are going to be concerning yourself about the biology, whereas the technical side of things, the toolkit, will be more handled by the AI. So how do you see this? Do you see this the same way?
So I'm going to answer the easy way, which is to say it's both. So I think that there are definitely, there's definitely a role for what I call bioinformaticians. So in my mind, those are people who are focusing on methods and tools, algorithms, something like the BWA tool to be able to align FASTQ files to reference genomes. I think we need bioinformaticians who are, really technically oriented to be able to build those tools. And they may use large language models in the process of doing that. But I think their focus is more on let's build a really great tool that can be used for a lot of people. Whereas I think the other scenario is more what you're saying, where what I would call maybe a computational biologist or something along those lines, where their main focus, and the computer science researchers use this term end user programmers, where they're using programming as a tool for accomplishing biology, and that's their primary interest. And they still would need to write code and be proficient at writing code, but the level of proficiency would not be as high for most of those people. And so I think that in that scenario, a large language model could potentially do more of the work for them relative to the amount of work that could be done for a bioinformatician who's building a really advanced tool.
Okay. Yeah, I remember there were some people trying to answer those questions and trying to define bioinformatics as either you are a user or you are a developer, which more or less fits to what you're saying, I think. But I think that even the developer is a user, because for the same reason that you develop a tool, you are envisioning the application of the tool itself. So you don't work on the optimization of a alignment algorithm if you're not planning to align this to if you're not planning to apply this you know what I mean? At the end of the day, you are envisioning the use of the tool, not the tool itself. Even if you are a mathematician and you're trying to optimize the runtime of an assembly tool, which is known to be a bottleneck. So I wonder if ChatGPT will actually break the gap which was built by bioinformaticians between informatics and biology, where now the biological people were going to be able to do whatever a bioinformatician can do without the need of a bioinformatician. And those two groups are going to be able to effectively communicate. Yeah. So just random thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer, but I would say there's still a ways to go before that gap narrows a lot, in my opinion. I think there's potential for it to narrow a lot in the future, but I think with the current tools that we have right now, I don't see the models having enough ability to generate code that would replace the bioinformatician, in at least in the way I'm defining it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also think that it's just a matter of time, just like you say, and the coming generations, they are going to be born and raised with AI models. And just like my parents, they had to learn how to type on a keyboard. There were courses that they had to actually, typography, I think it was called, or something like that. I learned this by just playing video games. And
but I had a question also on that side, is that where you're talking, Stephen, about the prompt evaluation. So how we can develop, so for the people that don't know how to program and don't have the critical thinking yet of how can we teach them the prompt evaluation, so to ask the right question even when they don't know yet. So this is more on more in the educational side now also.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't given a lot of thought to that. I'll have to think a little bit more, but I do think that could be something that is, well, let me say two things on it. The first is, I think that's something that could be emphasized more in bioinformatics educational materials and courses, is we have this really fancy tool that can do some really interesting stuff. Now, how do we use that tool most effectively? I think there could be, a unit in a course on doing that. On the flip side of that, I heard an anecdote recently of people who were going to industry, like internships. These were students who were going into industry to work on code in an industry setting, and they were expressly forbidden from using large language models in their industry setting for security reasons. So I think, there's sort of some trade-offs there that we can train people how to use them well, and I think we should do that to a certain extent, but it also reinforces this idea that people do need to have these skills independently to a certain extent to be able to, be programmers independently without having a large language model do everything for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to be able to build it, to the knowledge and the critical thinking of that. Thank you. I think that we have Rob as well, and there is another question as well in the chat.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for the talk. Really, really fascinating. I have a question. I think you touched on this. It's really about how to incorporate data into programming through ChatGPT, for example. So a lot of what we do with our students will present them with a fairly large scale data set, and then ask them to solve problems or do some data mining on that data. So is that feasible also with ChatGPT, or is that sort of coming down the pipeline, or have you developed tools for that kind of thing?
So do you mean creating educational exercises that use data files?
Right. So, I guess more on the sort of data science side, you'd have exercises that use specific data, and I suppose you would want the AI tool to actually sort of understand what that data is, or to understand at least the structure of it, so that it could generate code that answers certain questions on top of it.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, in that first study that I described, probably 20% of the exercises out of the 184 had data files that students were supposed to use to answer some type of question. And I just fed those into the model and let it try to figure out what to do with the data. And it seemed like it was able to identify what was a TSV or a CSV file, or, those kinds of things. I did have some problems where when the files were particularly large, that the prompt was too long so ChatGPT would just say, sorry, I can't accept an input that large. But if you have relatively small files, we also had some with FASTA files where it was able to write code to successfully parse FASTA files, for example. So I think there's already an ability to do that. It's not, I think one limitation is it's not structured. Like when you're creating a prompt to give to the model, there's not a structure where you can say, okay, here's the data and here's the prompt or whatever. It's all just kind of one big blob of text that you're giving to the model. And it's pretty good at deciphering that, but not perfect.
Okay, so you don't have to explain the structure of the data, or the fact that if you've got a matrix or something like that, you're giving to the tool, what the dimensions or anything like that. It's going to figure that out.
Yeah, at least to some extent, it figures it out. And I should say too, those seem to be the types of problems. Well, maybe that's not fair. I just remember interacting with the model, and it seemed like it would struggle. It would take a few more iterations to get those ones right than the ones that were shorter or simpler prompts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We still have another question.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Rob, as well, for the question. So from Pamela, do you think it's possible that the students who used the virtual assistant but performed worse on the exams were relying too much on the assistant and not fully retaining the code method?
Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. It is. I don't think we have enough data yet to be able to answer that, but if the pattern that we saw in our pilot study holds, I do think there's potential that could be what's happening. We'll kind of wait and see, but it's possible that we're giving too much help to the students.